Hello. Welcome to Aberdeen ao Vivo. My name is Michael Ullman, and I'm delighted to introduce and be the discussant for Dr. Chandrasekaran for his talk at Aberdeen ao Vivo. As I said, my name is Michael Ullman. I'm a professor of neuroscience at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. I was fortunate to also have been invited to give a talk at Aberdeen ao Vivo in June of last year, in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic. To remind you, Aberdeen ao Vivo is a project organized by the Brazilian Linguistics Association, together with various other organizations in Brazil and elsewhere. It has hosted many researchers of language, of which Dr. Chandrasekaran is the latest. Dr. Chandrasekaran, that is Bharath, is professor and vice chair for research at the University of Pittsburgh and a member of the Center for the Neural Bases of Cognition at the University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon University. Before coming to the University of Pittsburgh in 2018, Bharath was at the University of Texas in Austin. Before that, he was a postdoctoral fellow at Northwestern University in Chicago, and before that, he obtained his PhD at Purdue University. A very nice pedigree indeed. More importantly, Bharath is a leader in research on the neurocognition of speech perception and learning. Using multiple cognitive neuroscience approaches, including fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, diffusion tensor imaging to examine white matter, cortical and subcortical EEG, electroencephalography, and computational modeling as well, his laboratory focuses on two main areas. Number one, understanding brain dynamics during speech perception in challenging listening environments. And number two, understanding the functional dynamics of neural circuitry underlying speech categorization. His work is particularly interesting, both to me and in general, because he has tied speech learning to well-studied domain general learning mechanisms in the brain. Today, he will talk in part about this, as well as other issues related to, this is the title of his talk, neural systems underlying speech learning in adulthood. Please remember that you can ask questions during the talk in the chat, as well as afterwards, although I will ask Dr. Chandrasekaran questions from the chat only at the end of his talk, not during. Thank you, Bharath, very much for accepting to give a talk at Aberdeen ao Vivo. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Chandrasekaran.
Michael, I just wanted to confirm that you could see the screen and you can hear my voice. Great, thanks. Well, thank you so much. Thank the Brazilian Linguistics Association for this invite, Miguel and Michael. Thank you for suggesting my name for this series. Like thousands of students and researchers from across the world, I've immensely enjoyed virtual access to the Berlin talk series and the scientific discussions generated from this series. I really appreciated Michael's talk too. And if you haven't checked that out, please do, because that provides a greater scaffolding for some of the topics that I'm going to be discussing today. So my talk today will focus on the neural systems underlying speech learning in adulthood. What I'm going to do is summarize neural, behavioral, and computational results from several studies in my lab. And these have been spearheaded by immensely talented students and scholars, and I hope to represent each one of them as best I can within a larger thematic scaffolding. I especially want to acknowledge several funders for this line of research, including the National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, the Department of Defense, and the PNC Charitable Foundation, without whom this line of work would not be possible. All right, I'm going to kind of begin with defining some of the concepts we'll be discussing throughout this talk. The main focus here is speech learning in adulthood and the neurobiological constraints. Numerous behavioral neuroimaging studies have established a time period referred to as a phonetic sensitivity period, somewhere between 4 to 12 months, as being influential for speech perception. Prior to this time period, infants are fairly neutral to the sounds of the world's languages. During and after this period, there's greater neural commitment and preference to the phonemes of one's language that the infant is exposed to, and less commitment or less neural commitment and preference to non-native phonemes. This is really interesting, and infant speech perception has kind of led the way to almost as a poster child for the idea of a critical period, this phonetic sensitivity period. So defining what I mean by critical period, this is a narrow developmental time period during which environmental exposure and the statistics of the input actively shape perception. So, so speech learning has been construed and extensively studied within this lens of a critical period. And later studies have shown that learning and perceptual shaping is possible well beyond this so-called critical period. And during this time, passive exposure, so beyond the sensitivity period, just passive exposure for several years does not engender native-like percept or even production. So I mentioned the critical period, and there's enough findings to suggest that there's learning well beyond this, and people have now kind of switched the focus from critical to defining this as a sensitive period or an optimal period. And so this is kind of a softer stance on the abruptness of the offset of the time period. But irrespective whether you call it a critical period, a sensitive period, or an optimal period, the fundamental assumption here is that learning and perceptual shaping beyond the sensitivity period is reduced. So it's suboptimal or less sensitive. And so this is just a schematic from work from Patricia Kuhl's lab showing the phonetic sensitivity period. At this 6 to 8 month period, both native infants exposed to American English or Japanese tend to perceive the RL distinction very similarly, and be after that within about a period of 4 to 6 months, there's a dramatic difference between RL discrimination in the English exposed infants relative to the Japanese exposed infants. Now, a lot of work, and this was work that began at David Pizzoni's lab and has been carried forth by many researchers, has demonstrated that laboratory training, extensive training beyond the sensitivity period. So if you get these, as adults, so post maturity, you train participants to retrain and get them to discriminate speech sounds, there is significant and generalizable learning. So this is just a summary of some of the work that's been done by a number of colleagues from David Pizzoni's lab, basically showing that extensive training on the RL discrimination to monolingual Japanese listeners engenders significant and generalizable training. So this difference, so prior to training, they were pretty much pretty much at chance, and after training, there's significant improvement, and critically, this improvement is retained. It's not only generalizable to other segments, so untrained stimuli, but learners are also able to retain this 6 months, so well beyond after training. And 3 characteristics of the training seem to be particularly relevant in establishing generalizable training. One is high variability training involving multiple talkers and multiple segments. And the second is natural speech, so not synthesized speech, because natural speech has all the dimensions. It is clearly established as a multidimensional space. And trial by trial corrective feedback Now, there's lots of work to suggest that you need some feedback, but not necessarily explicit trial by trial feedback to engender significant learning. But these three characteristics have shown to result in generalizable learning. So that kind of sets up what I'm going to talk for the rest of this lecture. I'm going to discuss the neural systems underlying speech category acquisition. So much of the work prior has looked at behavioral changes and so shown that there's significant learning and generalization. My goal here is to ask, how do abstract non-native speech categories emerge in adults as they learn non-native speech categories? And does learning leverage domain general neurocognitive systems as a key intermediary? And what I'm going to then discuss is, do emergent sensory representations show similarities to native listeners, or are the emerging representations in non-native learners fundamentally different from native listeners? So this will be the first part of my talk. The second part of my talk focuses on individual differences in speech category learning success. And I'm going to scaffold this within a dual learning systems model, not unlike the multiple learning systems model that Dr. Ullman had specified in his talk. And I'm going to leverage the dual learning systems model to propose neurobiologically inspired training approaches that may potentially reduce the inter-individual differences in learning success. So this is kind of the larger outline, and I'm going to give you the roadmap here. The single organizing theme here is we're going to look throughout this entire talk of all the studies I'm going to talk about, how non-native listeners, so these are monolingual English speakers, learn Mandarin tone categories. And so this is going to be very across the different studies. I'm going to show you multimodal neuroimaging approaches to better understand how people learn or how categories are established. But we'll be using the same paradigm where learners make decisions based on the sounds that they hear. And we're going to look at how these learners do this using functional magnetic resonance imaging. So we'll be looking at blood oxygen level dependent changes as a consequence or of learning, as well as during learning. I'll be leveraging electrophysiological approaches to better understand sensory and perceptual plasticity as a function of training. And we'll then move on to the second part of the talk, where we'll be looking at I'll be defining dual learning systems model and discussing sources of individual differences scaffolded within the dual learning systems model. And finally, we'll discuss the training approaches that are inspired by the dual learning systems model that may reduce inter-individual differences in learning success. As I mentioned, tone languages are a window to examining experience-dependent plasticity to pitch. We know a lot about the neuroscience of pitch processing. So this is particularly useful in kind of understanding plasticity, because we have a well-established system to look at plastic changes. So the same syllable ma with a level tone means mother.
Ma.
With a rising tone.
Ma. Ma.
And with a dipping tone and with a falling tone mean 4 different words in Mandarin. Now, phonetically, these tones are described on a 2-dimensional space. So tone 1 refers to a high level tone based on the fundamental frequency. Tone 2 refers to a low rising tone pitch pattern, and tone 3 refers to a dipping pitch pattern, and tone 4 refers to a falling tone pattern. So, so if you change the pitch pattern, you can end up changing word meaning. In English, this change at the syllable level does not convey word meaning differences. So one characteristic of the training that that participants undergo is high variability training. So it's these pitch patterns are fairly perceptually discriminable for non-native listeners. But when you have multiple talkers, so in this case, this is the learning space here, the training space. So we have two female talkers, two male talkers producing these 4 different tones. These are native talkers across 5 segments: boo, dee, lu, ma, and me. So what participants have to do is, despite all this variability in segmental variability as well as talker variability, they need to learn to differentiate these tone categories. So that's kind of the learning task and the challenges there.
不 迪
鲁
密
So there's 4 different talkers producing these tones, and the learner's job is to ignore talker differences and focus on dimensions that are consistent across talkers and ignore dimensions that are less consistent across talkers. So this is not a trivial learning problem. And the way we train participants is present a stimuli, give them time to respond. So the participant here is tone 2, which is ma, and they have to make a judgment. Is it 1, 2, 3, or 4? So we give them 4 buttons to press, and the second they press the button, they get immediate feedback. So on every trial, they get feedback, so correct or incorrect. And behaviorally, we can establish learning within a single day. So usually about 450 trials, we can get significant learning. So remember that there are 4 tones. So chance performance with accuracy is 25%. So within the first block, which is about 40 to 80 trials, you can see that most individuals are doing pretty well. They're learning above chance. But by about 6 blocks of training, we get significant learning well above chance. You can see lots of individual differences. We'll be talking about that extensively. But overall, this pattern is very consistent across the various studies we have done. There's an initial sharp increase in learning, and then a fairly stable speech categorization performance. Right. All right, so I'm going to begin discussing individual studies. So in the first set of studies, we looked at learning in the scanner with functional magnetic resonance imaging. But before we looked at non-native listeners learning Mandarin tone categories, we wanted to look at how these representations are in native listeners. So this is work done by Gangi Feng, who was a postdoc in my lab. And he basically looked at native speakers of Mandarin Chinese and established these representations of tone categories in multiple parts of the brain. So in this experiment, he had listeners either passively listen to the tone categories or actively produce these. So so they had to without actually articulating it, act like they are. So they hear the tone category, and then they covertly repeat what category that is, or they're asked to button press or make a categorization decision. So is it tone 1, 2, 3, or 4? So common to all these different tasks is that they hear the sound, the tone category initially, but the tasks are fundamentally different. So one involves just passive listening, one involves a covert repetition, and one involves a button press. What Gangi then did was use multivariate pattern classification. So looking at activity patterns within different brain networks that were able to decode the different tone categories above chance. So is there information within the voxels of the brain that differentiates the tone categories? So that's kind of the initial question here. And he followed that question up by asking, what are these, so in regions that have significant decoding of tone categories, what information drives the tone decoding? And he used an approach called representational similarity analysis to ask this question. So to cut to the chase, he found 3 brain regions that showed tone category information in native listeners: the left superior temporal gyrus, the right superior temporal gyrus, and the left inferior parietal lobule. And these 3 brain regions had information related to tone categories, but what kind of information they carried was different across the different regions. So the right superior temporal gyrus carried dimensional information related to pitch height as a dimension predominantly, whereas the left STG showed more multidimensional representation of a tone category. So they involved not just pitch height, but also pitch direction. So this is native listeners. So remember, our kind of where we're going is how do non-native listeners, so adults, learn these categories? And so to answer that question, Hangyol Yi, who was a doctoral student in my lab, basically had native English speakers, monolingual English speakers, learn these Mandarin tone categories within a whole session. So close to about 200 to 300 trials of training. And participants were learning in the scanner. So these studies are not the first to look at non-native speech learning in the scanner. But these are the first to kind of document the process of learning. So not look at pre versus post-training differences, but actually look at the process of learning. So when learners are learning to categorize tones and getting feedback, what is the process underlying it, and how does this work? And to do this, we used this jittered paradigm where we jittered feedback from the stimulus to response. And this allowed us to separately estimate brain responses to the stimulus response and to the feedback. So this allowed us to kind of decouple representational changes versus changes that are responsive to the feedback, whether it's correct or incorrect, which was visually presented. Okay, so the basic finding in this study was that much like native listeners, the left superior temporal gyrus showed emergent tone representations. So in the left STG, as participants learned, so the second half of training relative to the first half of training, there were greater information related to tone categories that was emergent. So basically, there's the left SCG did not differentiate between tone categories in the first half of training, but by the second half of training, these representations are emerging. And in very, very similar brain regions to where we saw representations in native listeners. And so that's the cluster here that is a function. So the cluster here is a function of the emergent representations. So this wasn't there in the first half of training, that emerges the second half of training. Feedback information activates a part of the brain called the basal ganglia, specifically here, one part of the basal ganglia, the putamen. So these regions are important for reinforcement learning, but we now know that they are critical for all kinds of learning. And so feedback, so whenever participants got a correct answer relative to an incorrect answer, activated this part of the brain. So one thing that we wanted to look at was, are there functional connectivity? So is there a coupling between these brain regions where there's emergent representation and these brain regions where there is feedback related activity? And we found that towards the later half of training, so the second half of training, we found this dramatic difference where when participants when they were processing an incorrect response, there's greater coupling between these two brain regions. So the brain regions where representations emerging and the brain region that carries information about the correctness of the response, they start talking to each other much more when there's an incorrect response. And very interestingly, we looked at diffusion tensor imaging that basically looks at the connectivity, the structural connectivity between these two brain regions. So this is a scan that we collected even prior to the training process. So it's not these structural connectivity differences are not a property of training itself, but they drive individual differences even before training. So the greater the structural connectivity by this metric, the FA metric, between the superior temporal gyrus, where the representations are, and the putamen that carries information related to the correctness, the greater structural connection, the stronger is both the emergent representation as well as the behavioral accuracy. So people who have a stronger corticostriatal connection prior to training end up showing more robust representations as well as better behavioral performance. Right. So going back to the question of how similar are native and non-native brain representations for tone categories. So Gangi then followed up the two prior studies by looking at directly comparing brain activation patterns between native listeners and non-native listeners. So this is just a graphical illustration of the calculation of inter-subject neural representational similarity. So neural activation patterns are basically extracted from predefined regions of interest. So in this case, the superior temporal gyrus. And the neural dissimilarity matrices are calculated separately for each group. So the learners are monolingual English speakers learning these Mandarin tone categories. The native speakers, this is data collected by Gangi in Taiwan. And here, these speakers are native Mandarin speakers. And so we calculate the neural representational dissimilarity matrix separately for learners and the native speakers. So then what we do is then compare each learner's neural representation dissimilarity matrix with every native listener's neural representational dissimilarity matrix for every ROI region of interest. So basically, this is kind of a brain-to-brain representational similarity analysis, and we then use that to predict learning success, and both in terms of outcome and speed. So what you see here in the graph to the right is across early blocks. So this is the first half of training or the second half of training. So the early blocks versus late blocks. Early blocks, the observed outcome and the predicted outcome are not related, but later blocks of training, we see that there's a strong relationship between the observed outcome and predicted outcome. So basically, what that means is that more native-like representation within this larger speech network are associated with better learning outcome. So if a learner has a representation that closely matches a native Chinese listener, then they're more likely to be successful in learning these Mandarin tone categories. So these are just a summary of several functional magnetic resonance imaging studies that we conducted. And they tell us that representations are emergent. They tell us that there are domain general neurocognitive systems, the corticobasal ganglia network, that are critical for this. They tell us that more native-like representations are associated with better outcome. But functional magnetic resonance imaging is slightly limiting in the sense that while it has excellent spatial resolution, it doesn't have the temporal resolution for us to really look and deep dive into trial by trial. What's happening? What are the representation changes that are happening? So we followed up these fMRI studies with collaborative work. So this is work spearheaded by Matt Leonard at UCSF and Eddie Chang at UCSF. So my graduate student who completed his doctoral training with me went to work with them and kind of carried out this protocol of Mandarin tone learning, but in patients with epilepsy who had electrodes placed within their brain. So this is meant to monitor the intractable epilepsy that they have. But during the process, they're in the hospital. They also choose to participate in experiments. So one of the experiments that we conducted was having them learn these Mandarin tone categories. So with electrocorticography, we have much better signal to noise ratio that we can look at single trial. So learning that's at the level of local neuronal populations within the superior temporal gyrus. So questions we can ask here are what neural changes underlie trial by trial fluctuations in behavior. So we're talking trial by trial here during speech category learning. And we can also get at the question of the stability versus plasticity trade-off. So during learning, do all neuronal populations within the superior temporal gyrus fundamentally behave the same way, or are they different? And are some neuronal populations more amenable to change during learning? So it's the same paradigm here, 4 different talkers, 5 different segments, and you can see the variability of the tone patterns here across different talkers. And the difference in the training here, and so some participants, some patients got a lot more exposure of the same categories, or so many more exposure than we normally do in our behavioral training paradigms. And so this allowed us to look at exposure as well as learning within neuronal populations in the superior temporal gyrus. So these are the grids that are in 10 different patients. And you can see that these grids are based on clinical necessity, but you can see that the superior temporal gyrus has good coverage across these different patients. Okay, so what did we find? We found that there's tremendous amount of complexity in different electrodes. So I just wanted to orient you here. So the sound sensitive electrodes are in these smaller dots, the black dots. And so these are responsive to sound relative to silence, and there are many of them. Then there are electrodes that show some form of learning in red, and there are fewer of them. And then there are electrodes that show changes purely on the basis of exposure. So they keep track of prior exposure. Whereas these learning electrodes have a complex set of response properties. So some are responsive to correctness in late trials, not the early trials. Some show the inverse, where they show more responsive to incorrect trials towards the later training trials. And then some show reduced responses to the tones only for incorrect trials that occur later in learning. So this is really interesting because it kind of shows you the stability plasticity dynamic at play. Now, what defines learning electrodes versus exposure related electrodes? It turns out that there's just much more variance in electrodes, learning electrodes. So there's no one-to-one response patterns in the learning related electrodes. They're much more variable related to the exposure related electrodes that are a little less variable. So in this case, variability is a good thing because it allows you to start representing information as a function of training, right? So the conclusion of this study is that there's interesting stability plasticity dynamic that's at play, and there are electrodes that underlie the emergent representations that I demonstrated using functional magnetic resonance imaging in a neurotypical population in the previous slides. So we've basically established that representations emerge as a function of training, and the more native like it is, the more chances that the learner is more successful. The question that we wanted to further pursue is related to sensory changes. Does the sound to category training paradigm that I showed, within the span of a single session or over multiple sessions, does that fundamentally change sensory responses underlying these tones? So in this case, so here everything that I've showed you here are abstract responses that are talker invariant, sometimes task invariant. The question we're asking is, if we kind of unravel this further, what is the lowest level at which these changes can happen as a function of training in adulthood? So this really is asking the question of how much can we stretch plasticity? Does our representation of sound information that's critical to these tones itself change as a function of training? And for this, we used a different approach, of electroencephalography, and in particular, a component called the frequency following response. And the frequency following response is collected. It's remarkably simple how we collect this neural data. Participants are watching a subtitled movie through insert earphones. We present tones repetitively, and we have a very simple scalp electrode setup here. And the stimulus is presented. We present many thousands of the stimuli really rapidly. And so that's the stimulus. And this is kind of the brain response. That's an average brain response of thousands of presentations. And if you notice that the brain response looks very similar to the stimulus, that's because it is. We are collecting face lock activity from neural ensembles across the auditory pathways. So these neural ensembles respond to periodic stimuli, and so it's the frequency following responses. That's the brain response here is a fantastic metric to study the representation of pitch relevant information. So the idea is that the frequency following response is a complex response, and these neural ensembles are all across the auditory pathway, and we're collecting the response far field from the scalp. So this response has been extensively used by a number of people, Krishnan and colleagues at Purdue, and Nina Cross and her colleagues at Northwestern, to look at experience-dependent plasticity. This is work from my lab, basically showing that when you take Chinese listeners and English listeners, there are differences in the representation of fundamental frequency. So this is the rising pitch pattern. This is the low rising tone 2. And what we can do is extract the fundamental frequency from the stimulus, extract the fundamental frequency from the frequency following response, and compare them against each other. So the question here is, how similar are they? So are they highly correlated, in which case there's robust neural response that closely follows the stimulus pitch, or is it, in this case, in this English listener, there is some amount of pitch tracking, neural pitch tracking, but it kind of when the pitch accelerations really increases, you can see that this individual is able to less effectively track the pitch change. What we did was we brought these individuals back across 5 different days. So they came back and we passively recorded the frequency following responses to the different tones. And we found that the cross-language differences, so more robust representation of pitch patterns, neural pitch patterns, neural pitch tracking, is much more robust in native listeners relative to non-native listeners. And that's consistent across the different days of recording. So whether it's day 1, day 2, or day 3, there are these cross-language differences. So it's just passively exposing English listener to these tones doesn't change their sensory responses. So what can then change the sensory responses? Can we train participants to a high degree of near nativeness in tone categorization? Will that result in changes to the frequency following responses? So this is work spearheaded by Rachel Reedsky, who was a doctoral student in my lab. This was her dissertation. What she did was have 20 participants who were native English speakers, monolingual listeners, learn these Mandarin tone categories. And we had these predefined metrics for success. So the novice is when they did their first day of sound to category training. And we call them as experienced if they achieved 90% accuracies for 3 consecutive days. And once they reach this stage or phase, we overtrain them. So we train them for 10 more days. So 10 more days of training. And then we stopped training. And 2 months later, they came for a post-training retention session where we measured their frequency following response and looked at whether they still were able to categorize these Mandarin tones to high degrees of accuracy. So what does the behavioral data look like? We'll be able to actually demonstrate a high degree of learning, and we were able to. So these are all the participants in the study. We had 2 individuals drop off, but 20 out of the 22 were able to complete this entire phases of training. So at the novice stage, so this is day 1, you can see lots of variability, and different individuals reach the experience stage at different times. So you can see kind of the black line here is the average time taken. And you can see that the gray bar here refers to what native Mandarin listeners are performing at. So they do this tone category task at really high degree of performance right away. And so that's kind of our marker for success. And you can see that they continue to maintain that high degree of performance. And then 8 weeks of where they do not train, we bring them back. Importantly here, they're still able to retain these tones, tone categories with a high degree of accuracy. So they perform very much like how they were performing at the overtrained stage. So learning gains are retained 8 weeks beyond the period of training. We did lots of interesting things with these individuals. We even had them categorize these tones under a dual task. So this is really looking at how automatized is their responses, are their behavior responses, and they were able to maintain this really high degree of accuracy even under dual task constraints. In addition to the frequency following response that I showed you, that's the metric of sensory processing, we also had a metric of categorical perception. So this is a perceptual identification task where we had a continuum from a level tone to a rising tone. This is what it sounds like. So we did this classic categorical perception experiment, and they had to identify, this continuum into whether into a level or a rising categories. And so native identification, this is in Chinese listeners, shows this classic categorical perception identification pattern. So the sigmoidal curve, whereas at the novice stage, so when they're just starting off, you can see that the non-native, the English listeners, the learners are not categorical. So this is kind of where we're going with this experiment. So the hypothesis is that one hypothesis is that you need fundamental changes in the sensory system. So right at the initial stage of learning. So right away, there's sensory enhancement that's critical. So sensory information improves. And this improvement leads to better speech learning success. Now, you could also hypothesize the alternative here, which is basically that this is more in line with the reverse hierarchical theory that states that changes emerge at much later stages of speech learning expertise. So this is the theory states that changes happen at the highest level, at more abstract levels, and once these abstract representations emerge, they assist through top-down feedback networks, fine-tuning the sensory encoding. So this is the reverse hierarchy theory, which has really been popular in the neuroscience domain. And so these are two competing hypotheses that we wanted to test. All right, so so we have two metrics here. One is a perceptual identification. So we're calculating the slope here, and the gray bar here refers to Chinese listeners, and the yellow are the English learners, the English monolingual English learners. And perceptual identification refers to how categorical are their behavioral responses. Sensory encoding refers to the representation of the tones. So how similar is the brain response to the stimulus that's evoking it, the tones that are evoking it. So at the novice level, both perceptually and sensory, there's large cross-language differences. But once participants are experienced, you can see that they become more categorical. Same individuals are showing more categorical patterns, and so the slope increases. Whereas the stimulus response function here, the frequency following response, remains pretty much the same. So no sensory change, but large perceptual change. When they overtrain is when we start seeing changes in the frequency following responses. So more robust representation of tone categories at this point in time when they overtrain. And importantly, whatever change was created as a function of training is retained. So at retention, there's substantial difference relative to novice, and also no difference from native listeners with both perceptual slope, so how categorical their responses are, as well as the sensory representation indicated by the stimulus to response function. So both sensory and perceptual gains are retained 8 weeks beyond the training period. So this is very consistent with predictions from the reverse hierarchy theory that suggests that what drives performance is at a much higher level of representation, and with gaining expertise, plasticity kind of trickles down to lower and lower levels until sensory representation itself can be modified. So just to summarize here, there's abstract representation of category information in the bilateral superior temporal gyrus in native listeners. This happens within 100 trials. They're behaviorally relevant. Their abstract representations emerge in the STG, and more native-like representations in the STG engender greater learning success. And auditory corticostriatal connectivity and functional coupling between representational regions and domain general cognitive systems, corticostriatal systems, relate to individual differences in learning performance. And we'll belabor this point in the next section, but the hypothesis here is that the striatum is a key intermediary for speech learning in adulthood when unsupervised learning mechanisms are less labile. So just passive exposure doesn't see, or distributional exposure doesn't seem to engender as much plasticity as involving these domain general corticostriatal networks using feedback. And so when reinforcement learning mechanisms are still functional, like they are in adults seem to leverage this to learn. Sensory plasticity is not critical for early stages of learning, but in line with the reverse hierarchy theory, training-related sensory enhancements may be an outcome of increasing perceptual expertise. So that's kind of the interim summary of the first part. So moving on, the second part, we are going to deep dive into sources of individual differences in speech learning success. Like I mentioned, we'll scaffold it with the dual learning systems model, and then discuss some training approaches to reduce inter-individual differences in category learning success. Just having a quick check on time here. Great. So I mentioned that one session of training is enough for significant learning, but what I didn't mention in those previous slides was that this is when you look at the average response. So on an average, participants learn from about 25% to reach about 70 to 75% in accuracy. So they're doing well. And I showed you before that you can get them to come back and learn to the same extent as native listeners and discriminating these tones. But what I didn't show you was that there are substantial individual differences in learning success. So now each of this is a single individual, and each study here is more and more participants. So here are about 200 participants. You can see that almost every point of accuracy is represented. So learners are highly, highly variable. And even though a substantial amount learn, several do not learn, and several learn to moderate levels of success. So we combine all the data we've collected, which is about 700 to 800 participants, and we see the same pattern. So this is about 705 participants. And I wanted to mention that most of these studies are, we've tried to create groups that are as homogeneous as possible. So they are monolingual listeners with minimal musical experience. So they are as homogeneous as we could make it, mostly undergraduates. And you could see that even while keeping those differences to the minimal, we still see these large individual differences. And so one of the goals here is to go towards a mechanistic understanding of individual differences. I mentioned this before, but we think that in adults, when unsupervised learning processes are less plastic, they require these feedback-driven corticostriatal loops to act as intermediaries in training. And they are critical and may probably be critical in driving individual differences. So our hypothesis is that early in learning, there is a large network where learners are much more analytical and reflectively processing these categories or trying to come up with hypotheses and test it. But as they're more experienced, they're more automatized and leverage a different network that's more procedural based until they're really, really very good at this task or acquire these categories to native-like precision where the cortex drives behavioral performance. So that's kind of the idea here, is that different networks come into play at different stages of learning. So our model is derived from models of category learning in the visual domain from Ashby and colleagues, the COVIS model as an example, and also models that Michael has specified in his talk, the declarative procedural based models. So these are similar, but not the same. And I'll kind of expand on it. So the idea here is that there are two competing systems, learning systems that drive performance on every trial. And one we call as a reflective system or the sound to rule system. So this system is rule based, and it builds hypotheses based on listening to the stimuli. Participants are coming up with hypotheses. They can verbalize what the hypotheses are. And so this is an individual who may say that's category 4 because it sounded high and flat. On the other hand, you may have a more procedural-based system that's more reflexive, and this is typically non-verbalizable. Participants aren't able to tell you exactly what strategies they're using. We think this is more optimal for speech, given the high dimensionality of speech categories. It's really hard to form, form very sensible rules that disambiguate all the categories when it comes to speech categories. So importantly, the neural systems underlying it are fundamentally hypothesized to be different. So the reflective system is predominantly prefrontal and hippocampus. So the idea is that rules are generated and stored within domain general networks that are prefrontally driven. And on the other hand, you have a procedural based system that depends on whether the stimulus response contingency is rewarded, the rewards processed by the ventral striatum. And if a button press in response to a sound is rewarded, then this network then starts learning the stimulus response patterns better. So this is a different network, and that's hard to verbalize. And so this model is something that we developed called the dual learning systems model. It specifically, we took that to and applied it to speech learning. So the idea here is that there's competing feedback dependent neural circuits that mediate speech learning. And one is explicit working memory system dependent hypothesis testing system, and that mediates the learning of simple rules. And the second system is the implicit procedural based system that's more reward based, and it learns multidimensional category structures that are not discernible easily by rules. And the idea is that these systems compete on every trial, and that humans show an initial bias towards reflective processing. So given feedback, the participant basically tries to generate rules, or adults, let's say, they start with this reflective system, and successful learners, we hypothesize, are more likely to switch to more reflexive processing if the reflexive system is more accurate, more optimal for the task. I have a couple of videos and audios to play. So this is my 8-year-old. So he was about 5 or 6 at this time when I shot this video. He just started learning Mandarin at school. So I was kind of curious. Do you know what tones are? And this is kind of his description.
High and steady, up, dip, low, down.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, I've played that video many times. So he basically just gave these mnemonics for or rules for the 4 categories, right? The question we had was, do our participants, after their sound to category learning training, can they tell us what those categories are? So here's one participant describing a category.
Words that are flat, meaningless, that you don't need to accentuate.
So he says, this participant says words that are flat need to be accentuated. And so he goes into detailed description of the stimuli. This participant performed at about 80% accuracy at the end of training, so pretty good learner. Here's another participant describing the tone categories.
I don't remember category 4.
I'm not sure you heard that really well, but this participant basically said, I don't remember category 4. This participant's also performing at 80%, but cannot tell us what strategies he was using in getting to that high level of accuracy. So you can see large differences in learning success and strategy use. So when we had participants in the scanner, we were able to look at the responses to feedback specifically, and we found that correct relative to incorrect activates both the reflective and the reflexive network. So the prefrontal cortex that we think critical for rules, the dorsal and ventral striatums important for reward processing and reflexive processing, and the anterior cingulate that's important for error monitoring and guiding behavioral choices, keeping track of the history of action and outcome. So very complex network seems to activate when participants process feedback information, and it involves both the reflective and the reflexive network. So to deep dive, we used computational models. So this is quantitative decision-bound models to gain insights into where the performance deficits and enhancements are. So these make assumptions about the categorization strategy used by the observer. So basically, we can look at the response patterns from the the learner and try to hypothesize what strategy they're trying to use. And so some of these strategies are reflective models. So these are based on the neurobiology of striatal medium spiny neurons. So they're the basis of procedural-based learning. And some of them are reflective models. So these are based on simple rules, unidimensional rules, or more complex conjunction rules. And so here's an example of a unidimensional height-based strategy. This participant is making response judgments. So they're categorizing purely on the basis of pitch height. So you can see that that is good to demarcate some categories, like tone 1 and tone 3 are fairly dissimilar with respect to pitch height, but tone 2 and tone 4, the dynamic tones, have very similar pitch height and are differentiated predominantly on pitch direction. So you need more multidimensional rules. And so you can also have a multidimensional rule-based strategy that's conjunctive rule here. That is a very complex rule. And this is good for getting high accuracies, but it's also somewhat resource intensive. So you need to hold on to very complex rules while making judgments. That's resource intensive. So what we can do is look at block by block, what's the best fitting model when participants are making these category judgments. And this is here's the proportion of participants who end up using these different strategies. Random strategies are predominantly used by non-learners, so they are just button mashing. They may be switching strategies constantly, but they're not locking on to a reliable strategy. Several learners also use pitch height. You can see that here. Some use pitch direction. Mostly by the end of training, a lot of participants start using more of the reflexive striatal-based pattern classifier model. And this is kind of the procedural-based model that's more reflexive than reflective. Importantly, we found that those who used a more computationally reflexive strategy also showed greater putamen. So this is part of the striatum activation. So there's a relationship between higher putamen activation and the use of this reflexive strategy. So this is the model. The idea is that there are these two competing systems. They're competing on every trial, and if ideally the learner generates some rules, gets to some level of success, and once that success is there, that those form rewards, and that reward then scaffolds the further learning in a reflexive procedural based way, which may be more optimal for learning speech categories. Now, if you're stuck for some reason with simple rules and don't move on, you may not be as successful. If you never switch to a procedural-based strategy, you may not be. You may be, using too much resources, and that might result in kind of resource depletion. And so that's also less optimal. So we've done several studies looking at sources of individual differences. And so what I'm going to cover is a few of those studies that will look at individual differences and where the sources are. We look at working memory, musicianship, aging. We've done some work on elevated depressive symptoms. So individuals who report more elevation depressive symptoms. I'm not going to get into these two studies for sake of time, but here's a reference if you want to look at it. We'll then move to optimal training paradigms. So training paradigms that kind of allow participants to switch faster to more procedural-based strategies. We have several of these we have tried, and I'll walk you through some of the key studies here. All right, so we're kind of in the final stretch here. So this is looking at working memory capacity, where we had individuals perform an operation span test. It's a complex test where you not only have to retain information in your working memory, but you have to retain it under interference. So it's a fairly difficult task. So we had participants perform this operational span prior to training, to sound to category training, and we had participants either median split as higher working memory or lower working memory capacity. So those individuals who are higher or those who are lower. We also just looked at working memory capacity is a continuous measure, and irrespective of how you look at it, whether you split it into groups or you look at it as a continuous measure, there is a strong relationship between working memory capacity and speech category learning success. So those individuals who have higher working memory capacity seem to, not differ from those with lower working memory capacity early in learning, but then they quickly start separating out, and they are substantially different by the end of training. And when you look at generalization to untrained stimuli, there are differences between the groups as well. Now, this looks at the computation models and at early in training versus late in training. Early in training, both individuals with lower working memory and higher working memory seem to use, fairly similar models or strategies. But there are differences at the late learning stage. So, blocks 4 to 6, we start seeing that individuals with higher working memory capacity are able to make that switch to the SPC. That's the reflexive procedural-based strategy that we think is more optimal. And there's just fundamental differences between the groups, with the individuals with low working memory capacity tending to use more suboptimal rules and inconsistent strategies relative to those with higher working memory capacity. Now, one key thing about this study, which just came out in Brain and Language, was that we also had participants, do the learning task while hooked on to an eye tracking device. So this is the iLink 1000 Plus. We are watching their pupil responses. So we are looking at pupil dilation as a metric, and the goal here is that to look at changes in effortful processing. So when somebody listens to sounds in more challenging listening environments, or is challenged in general, there's greater pupil dilation. And so that's reflective of many complex set of activities the brain undergoes that involves some amount of increased effort. So we wanted to uncover what's happening, to these individuals by looking at their eyes, and we find this very interesting pattern. So individuals with higher working memory relative to lower working memory are fairly very similar in early stages of learning, but there are dramatic differences in the later stage. So one is that there's there's greater reduction in pupil dilation for individuals with higher working memory from early to late. And there's also greater differentiation between correct and incorrect responses for individuals who have higher working memory relative to lower working memory. So individuals with higher working memory experience greater reductions in pupil responses for correct trials and show larger differences between correct and incorrect trials compared with participants with lower working memory scores. So greater differentiation between what's correct and what's incorrect, and greater reduction as a function of training. And this to us suggests that as individuals learn and switch to more procedural-based strategies, there's less effort on their part, and that shows up in their pupil dilation. We've done work looking at musicians with more than 10 years of experience, have a substantial learning advantage in learning these Mandarin tone categories. And not only do they learn faster and are more accurate and can generalize better, they also switch to a more procedural-based strategy. So this is the block at which the first, the model best fit. The best fit model was the SPC, the reflexive model. That happened much earlier for musicians relative to non-musicians. So musicians able to make that switch faster. And younger adults have a substantial learning advantage relative to older adults. Computationally, this is driven mostly by the fact that older adults tend to use perseverate with rules that are not optimal, so suboptimal rules. They never switch, even though they are learning. They are using pretty simple unidimensional rules that doesn't get them to high levels of accuracy, and don't switch to multidimensional strategies. All right, so these these studies gave you some highlights about individual differences and some of the sources. We can also leverage this dual learning systems approach to predict what might be useful as a learner. So how can we change the training paradigm? And so one of the things is informational content. So in this experiment, we had participants undergo learning. One group had minimal feedback, so they were just given correct or incorrect or right or wrong. And a second group got full feedback, and here they not only got the same information the minimal feedback group got, but they also got additional information. So if they were wrong, they were also pointed to the right category. So this is called rich informational full feedback. And this intriguingly impairs learning of manner and tone categories. So participants are less successful with full feedback relative to minimal feedback. So it goes back to the principle of less is more, which is very, very clearly seen here. We can also mess with the timing of feedback. So immediate feedback shows a big learning advantage. Individuals who are in a paradigm with immediate feedback relative to a delay of 1 second. So 1 second is not very perceptible to the participant, but it just does a big difference with learning success. And we found that 500 milliseconds seems to be the kind of the optimal timing that's prescribed by models that are based on the dopaminergic learning systems. So the optimal feedback seems to be, with a slight delay. So there's a sense of expectation, but not such a long delay that your reflective, analytical systems start dominating learning. We've also played around with variability. So mixed talkers relative to block talkers. So when we intersperse the trials with different types of talkers, there's a learning advantage. And we think what that does is basically pushes people away from hypothesis testing and building rules based on one talker that they can't generalize to another talker. And that's the key to the learning here. Generalizable learning is that you generalize to a novel talker, irrespective of what talker information you've learned. We can also, give more specific directions, right? So the base learning paradigm I showed you is very simple. It's meant to be simple because we can then explore it with a great amount of rigor across all the different experiments that I've shown you. But what if you start layering it? So in this experiment, we asked, can we when providing instructions, so here the participant is told, prior participants have found that attending to pitch direction is useful. Another group got the directions that prior participants found that pitch direction but not height was useful as a strategy. So we did these different conditions and found that whenever you oriented participants to pitch direction, particularly, participants showed better learning. So, one of the cross-language differences that is really well established between Chinese listeners and English listeners or non-tone listeners is that the non-tone listeners, they are predominantly leverage pitch height, and that probably is derived from the importance of pitch height in differentiating talkers, and so when you give specific attention to get people to switch from making rules predominantly on pitch height to also incorporate pitch direction, then you engender greater learning. We've also done some really interesting studies related to putting people under pressure. So one of the hypotheses here is that under performance pressure, there's faster switches from reflective processes to more reflexive processes, and so what we did here was have participants come in, and they have a instruction screen. This instruction screen says that there's another participant, nearby. This participant is fictitious, but the participant who's doing the experiment doesn't know it. So we tell them that, both you and your partner need to get a really high accuracy to get a bonus. And so that's kind of a template to generate pressure. And when the participant then begins the experiment, the screen flashes saying your partner has completed the task successfully, and now it's all on you. So it puts this participant under a level of pressure. And we found that unlike tasks where there's greater quote choking under pressure, in learning these speech categories, there is performance enhancement. So there's faster switches to more procedural based SPC strategies under performance pressure. I'll conclude with this final study where we had learners hooked up to this non-invasive vagus nerve stimulation device. So this is for those of you who are not initiated into neuromodulation, many different approaches to modulate brain networks. There's TMS, TDCS. This approach leverages peripheral nerves, in particular the vagus nerve. So the afferents from the outer ear to various brain networks that can, when stimulated, result in large-scale neuromodulation. And so I don't want to get into too much of the details here, but this is work that's based on animal models where there's clear plasticity as a function of aligning vagus nerve stimulation to the audio. So in this case, we align them to either the pitch to some tones and not the others. So two tones. So the control condition is where there was no stimulation, and in the height condition and the direction condition, we either stimulated tone 1 and tone 3 in the height condition, or tone 2 and tone 4 in the pitch direction condition. So we established the base level of stimulation and go slightly below the sensory threshold. So participants don't know they're being stimulated, but we're aligning the stimulation to individual tones. And what we find is that when we align stimulation to tone 1 and tone 3, we find significant learning relative to and generalization relative to tone 2 and tone 4 being stimulated. And I refer you to the paper here to go into the complexities. But one of the hypotheses here is that stimulation increases arousal, and so when you're in a greater state of arousal and attentive state, you tend to prioritize information that is more salient. And pitch height being more salient to non-native listeners seems to be the dimension that they seem to latch onto and use that to enhance learning. So that's one of the hypotheses. Work on this front is still ongoing, and it's a really interesting area of research that we're taking and trying to apply to rehabilitation more broadly, not just second language training. All right, so I'm going to kind of summarize here the really large scale individual differences in learning success, domain general corticostriatal learning systems. These are called by different names: explicit, implicit, rule-based, procedural, reflective, reflexive, but just know that there are multiple learning systems, and these networks are constantly on while you're trying to learn something. And these may be as an adult, and these are key intermediaries in adult speech category acquisition. Reflective sound to rule network may scaffold early learning, but if you're successful, then you tend to switch to more optimal procedural based reflexive learning. And this kind of a trade-off between reflective and reflexive is really important. The relative balance is really important and may underlie individual differences in speech category learning success. Working memory capacity, musicianship, age all shift this balance, but you can optimize training to reshift the balance between these networks. And you could use neurobiologically inspired individualized training approaches. That's where we'd want to go to reduce these large variability in learning success. So I'm pretty close to being done here. I'll stop at the next slide, but I just wanted to give you an idea of this line of research. I view it as fairly reductionist. I really want to move on to studying real world, context-dependent learning. And it's important though to have an approach where you carefully constrain behavior and computational models to constrain the neuroscience, and then it can tell you all kinds of interesting things. And I think the real, if I want to summarize this line of research, it's been in establishing these underlying neural systems in a way that hasn't been defined in prior literature. And the hope is now to kind of not move away from this reductionist approach and start understanding the role of these systems, as an example, in second language learning more broadly. I'd love to have more discussion. I know that's a topic that Michael's keenly into, so I'm looking forward to discussion on that front. So I want to stop here and take any questions, and thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. That was fantastic. Really, really interesting. I learned a lot. We have lots to discuss, and I'll ask some questions here. Thank you very much, Bharath.
Thank you.
Let's see. I'll start with a few general questions. Actually, most of them are more interesting, I think, at the general level. I guess one question is, I'm not sure how to frame this. There's sort of different ways of thinking about this. Is what do you think the advantages or disadvantages are of thinking about these systems, these beasts, as reflective versus reflexive versus declarative or procedural memory, as defined, as we tend to conceptualize them, more based, learning and memory based on one or the other neural circuit, or explicit or implicit. They have, I think, maybe different strengths and weaknesses, different advantages. What do you think about that? And I'm not saying we should rely on just one approach, but
Michael, this is a topic we actively need to discuss in a level of depth. It's a great point. When we started publishing this work, it was mostly work that's derived from beautifully laid out models in the visual categorization world. And that world very carefully defined both the neurobiology and the underlying computational models that are derived from neurobiology. And so the systems that I'm referring to, reflective, reflexive, much more aligned with the way the visual cognition world looks at it. And it has components of the declarative system, obviously. So the way the medial temporal lobe is thought of in the categorization literature is that it supports the learning of simple rules, but more complex rules requires prefrontal and hippocampus interactions in learning. So that is, the reflective system is probably more divergent, but the procedural based system, I think there's a fair level of consistency in how the basic ganglia operates. So it definitely just doesn't, involve itself in learning Mandarin tone categories, but much more at a larger level. And I think there's a great level of alignment that we could have between our models, as an example on that front. But just to kind of summarize that, categorization is a fundamental property. So, taking continuously varying stimuli and mapping it onto stable categories is not just something that we do for speech, but we do for pretty much every process. And most organisms do this. It's a fundamental process. So these brain systems are there for that purpose and seem to leverage this while learning speech categories in adulthood, but they're meant for more broader learning of categories.
Thank you. I have lots of follow-up questions, but we can also discuss that individually. Let's see. Another sort of high-level question that I also have been struggling with, at least, is how to distinguish whether learning and or processing is taking place, for example, with neuroimaging data, right? So when you have, for example, activation of superior temporal gyrus or of parts of the basal ganglia, how do you know whether those structures are involved in learning and or processing? I think it's a really hard problem.
Yeah, I mean, we tend to go with this is not satisfactory in any way, because the non-invasive neuroimaging is, to me, only slightly better than behavior, right? What it tells you. Obviously, with the functional magnetic resonance imaging studies, the question was where things are happening, and we do find that these representations emerge in the superior temporal gyrus. What are they? What exactly are these representations? So one way to think about it is some of the work that we've done looking at representational similarity analysis suggests that they contain rich information related to dimensionality, so integrating multiple dimensions. So they in that would suggest there's some amount of processing information in them. But FMR, I can't get there to answer that question. So although we've tried to relate those to learning itself very, very broadly. So if you have stronger representations, you do end up learning faster and better. But that's also still very at a distal level. So more proximally, the corticography, the ECOG study, which I want to advertise that study. This is collaborative work with UCSF, and they were the prime drivers there in that study. And that's coming out in PNAS in this week or next week. So look out for that. There, there we kind of get into the real complexity of things, because all kinds of when we start looking zeroing in on neuronal populations, there are all kinds of changes happening. So there we can look at whether a single trial is related to the outcome, or is it related to more the sensory representation. So there's a lot of detail in that, and that should be accessible. The frequency following responses that I mentioned purely are related to sensory information, and these are actually separate from the training studies. So these are done prior to the training studies. We need thousands of stimuli, so we use stimuli that are not part of the training set. So those are just very, very much at a rudimentary sense. Are fundamental differences in sensory information driving learning? So to summarize, I'm not quite sure. I think there's a little bit of both in these emergent representations. Where we're going is bringing back participants who are at that supreme level of learning, where they're performing at really, really high levels, and to see what information those representations convey.
Another question. Thank you for that. Again, I look forward to speaking more in person about these issues. Another issue is, what is the relation between the reflexive versus reflective, or declarative versus procedural learning of the sort you're looking at, and the learning of other things, other functions, whether it's categories in other domains, modalities, such as visual category learning, or higher level, arguably, learning, like in the weather prediction task, if you consider that category learning, or other aspects of language learning, the sort that I look at, grammar, sequence learning, or in addition, like things like sequence learning, motor, perceptual motor sequence learning. So what you've looked at, I think, is mainly the learning of these speech sound categories and their characteristics, implicit or not, and under which circumstances learning is better and when it occurs and stuff like that, and the neural bases. But the relation to other types of learning other functions, learning other domains and modalities. Have you thought about that? What are your thoughts on that?
We've thought a lot about it. It's an unknown. I think it needs the same individual learning multiple tasks, preferably in the scanner, to make a strong case for it. I think that's fascinating. That's really interesting. I think I mentioned this earlier that this is obviously not just made for learning speech categories in adulthood, but serves a larger purpose of categorization more broadly. We've done some experiments with non-speech categories that are carefully created to either only be solved by rules or to be solved by pre-decisional integration of dimensions that cannot be verbalized. So that's more, careful constraint of what's verbalizable, what's not. And we find completely different neural networks consistent with two separate systems that are underlie the learning of those two categories that are completely, not speech. So they definitely have a core function. We've now completed several studies that suggest that there's a great degree of parallel between visual category learning and auditory category learning. So the same individual, this is work published in Psychonomics Bulletin and Review by a postdoc, Casey Roark, came this year. The same individuals learning rule-based visual categories and rule-based auditory categories tend to show very, very similar performances, both in terms of accuracies and strategies used. So that kind of speaks to the broader generalizability of these systems. But Michael, I think this is one of the discussions we need to have at length, because where we're also going is looking at these types of category systems, learning systems with the tasks that we have that either are optimized for one system or the other, or a hybrid like these speech categories are. We're looking at them in individuals who stutter, who have basal ganglia. There's some question to what issues with the basal ganglia in individuals with developmental dyslexia. So I know you've been going on that front to test those. So that's another way to start connecting those dots.
Thank you. I have more questions, but I think given the time, maybe we should stop. And thank you very much, Bharath, for a very, very interesting talk. And please, everybody, can you spread this talk to make sure that everybody can hear Bharath, and more generally, both of us would like to thank Berlin Auvivo. So thank you very much.